let's start with Last Transmissions.
Yeah.
This is a different role than we've seen you play before. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah.
How did the project come your way? What attracted you to doing this?
Lost Transmissions landed in my lap a couple of years ago, and firstly, I was really flattered that Catherine O'Brien, who's the director, kind of considered me for the role. You know, it's a dramatic role, and obviously, I guess, even though comedy was something I sort of drifted into through chance, I'd always trained as an actor, and I hadn't planned specifically to do just comedy. It was nice that she thought of me for the role. And also, I realized after however many years, 20 years of making films, I'd never worked with a female director on a feature film. And that felt terribly remiss, you know. So the opportunity to do a script like that and work with Catherine, it just seemed like a no-brainer. So I immediately said yes, and then we waited, I think, for 2 years for it to come together. It's an indie, it needed to get funded and find the right moment and the right cast. But I stayed resolutely attached to it because I was so committed to doing it, you know.
And the role is a music producer who suffers from schizophrenia, which is
Yeah.
a weighty topic for sure. Were you
Very.
worried about doing service to the character, to the material?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the heart of the film is about a friendship between, you know, my character Theo and Juno Temple's character Hannah, who is a sort of up-and-coming singer who also has her own sort of demons that she's battling, and it's about how they kind of help each other and how she helps him through his schizophrenic break, which he has. And I realized going into it that I'd have to research it and understand what schizophrenia is. It's a often, I think, misunderstood, underestimated condition. People assume it's like, oh, you've got lots of personalities. It's often talked about in a jokey way. People talk about going schizo. You know, this language that we use so often in our society often diminishes mental illness in ways that it dismisses it as being, you know, how often do you hear people called crazy because, I don't know, maybe they've got different ideas or they have, but it's often used in political context, you know, between, you know, there's no better way to diminish a rival than to call them crazy. So it felt like, let's get this right and let's understand what this is and try and portray it in a way that was faithful and authentic. And so I did. I went and spoke to some people and sat with people who have schizophrenia, were on the other side of it or in the midst of it, and read as much as I could, watched as many documentaries as I could, and spoke to the person who the film is based on as well, which was important for me. So yeah, it was probably the most research I'd done for a role.
What's the one aspect of the disease in particular that you wanted to get right the most, preserve on screen for people to understand?
Just the kind of, you know, what it is. I think schizophrenia is, as is understood, as I said, is often people see it as a very kind of binary splitting of the personality. It's not. It's more like it's to do with the neurons in the brain, the spacing. It's hard to kind of get into it, but there's a wash of information. We perceive reality through a specific kind of like that, say. I mean, it's easy to kind of metaphorically say all the reality we perceive is through there, but for schizophrenics it goes like this, and they're receiving so much information, the brain is trying to contend with it, rationalize it, it turns into patterns that suddenly make them paranoid, and it's sort of like a barrage of information and sound and auditory hallucination, which they're constantly having to deal with. And so, there's a lot going on inside. And when you see someone walking down the street and they're shouting or they're talking to themselves, that's what's happening to them. They're not just, you know, a kind of subsection of society that needs to be ignored. That person is going through something extraordinarily overwhelming and difficult. And it's no surprise that you often see those people homeless as well, because they find themselves very quickly, you know, shut out of mainstream society.
There's a great scene midway through the movie where your character's at the mixing board and he's sort of mixing for a band that's inside, and, he's about to go into one of his episodes, and suddenly the music starts to get wilder. He's experimenting with it.
Yeah.
It gets crazier, and then he pushes it too far.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting scene because sometimes we give into the cliche of the best artists being slightly crazy, as sort of what you were saying earlier, that craziness is something to value. I thought that was a really interesting scene.
Absolutely. That moment as well, they start to talk about whether or not the condition assists him in some way or gives him access to some other part of his brain. And the music in the film is quite plays quite an interesting part in terms of paralleling the sort of the waves of information that Theo is perceiving. And yeah, at that point he pushes it into this kind of cacophony of sound, which is just horrible. And that's kind of what he is experiencing all the time, you know. So yeah, that stuff was, Catherine's writing is really, really smart. And also the film itself it's kind of heartwarming, and it's a human relationship story as well. So there is this, you know, very, very serious subject matter, but it's treated in such a way that it's sort of compelling to watch on a human level, you know.
What was the scene that you were most nervous about performing? And as Theo, what was the scene that represented the biggest challenge to you?
I think the most challenging scenes were the deeper Theo got into his break. There's a great scene that Catherine decided to shoot as a one-er when Juno and Hannah and Theo are talking to each other across a table in a facility, and rather than shoot overs, Catherine just swung the camera between us and let the camera sort of tick-tock through time. It's very interesting because all Theo's delusional behavior is centered around time, his perception of time and how he thinks time behaves, and so Catherine just sort of tick-tocked between us, and it was like as soon as action got called, that was it, we were off. There was no room to kind of start again, as you can often reset yourself when you're shooting, because you know you can just cut to the other person. It was like theater, you know. So that was really, really fun. As an actor, that kind of stuff is the most enjoyable, most challenging.
I mean, you've been so involved behind the camera for some of the stuff you worked on as a writer, director, producer, and what was it like to give yourself over fully just to the role here?
I love doing that. I love just saying, okay, you deal with that, because as a writer, your mind is always on that, and if you read a script and there's stuff that you think, I'm going to change that, it can be a little bit distracting. But Catherine is a very collaborative director. Her sort of energy on set is extremely, it's conducive to creativity. So I was kind of like, I'm good with that, you know, I'm happy with the script. She let Juno and I improvise a little bit, so the naturalism in the film came from our just natural rhythms and stuff, and Catherine was very happy to let that, to encourage that. So yeah, it's nice sometimes to not have that other responsibility.
When you showed the film to audience or to the person that Theo is based on, what was the reaction like? Was that rewarding for you when they saw it?
I'm not sure. I think he's definitely seen it, and you know, he's happy to stay in the background and not sort of step forward and own that particular fact. But you know, it must be a strange thing to see your own life sort of interpreted artistically. But yeah, I think he likes it.
Again, I'm really fascinated with the idea of what we think of from artists and what we sort of what we perceive artists to be like. And it is as you were saying earlier with the cliche of just calling people crazy. And is there, being an artist yourself, is there something incorrect about this perception of artists having a bit of craziness to it? You have to have a bit of craziness to be an artist.
Yeah.
A great artist.
I think the whole notion of having to be crazy, in inverted commas, all depends on what your definition of crazy is. And I think crazy is an umbrella term for often for just eccentricity or thinking differently or having ideas that might not be in line with what the mainstream sort of opinion is. And if that is the case, then yes, I think all the best people are crazy in that respect. You know, it's important to be innovative. It's important to think outside the box. And you can often be accused of being crazy for doing that, you know. All the best artists get called that because what they're doing is unusual. You know, it's shining a light on reality in a way that hasn't been perhaps done before. And our immediate reaction always is to say, oh, that's crazy, because it's not normal. You know, it's not the mainstream idea. And, you know, in that respect, it's a good thing. As an artist, you have to kind of be in touch with your emotional responses, and your perception of reality has to be, you have to be very focused objectively on what that is. So, yeah, I suppose so. Maybe not crazy in a sort of medical sense. Conditions like schizophrenia and depression, they are medical conditions, you know. They might give you access to ideas that you might not have if you were completely straight. That's not necessarily a good thing.
What's been the most rewarding reaction you've heard from audiences when you screen the film?
Oh, look, I saw it for the first time with an audience last night, and it was wonderful because the audience really engaged with the film, and they found the lightness. Even in the darkest moments of the film, there is There are light moments. My character Theo is a nice guy. He's very charming and he's very funny, and even in his most sort of intense psychotic breaks, there are glimmers of that. You can still see his humanity, you know, and that's important because we have to remember that that guy on the corner with no shoes on, who's shouting at the top of his voice, is still a person. You know, there's still someone inside there. And having the audience kind of get that was nice. It was nice to see some of my friends. Zach Quinto came to see it, and he's living in LA now, and he said that the film's depiction of LA was very authentic, which is nice. It captured LA in a way that wasn't sentimental or sort of, it's kind of like the anti-La La Land, and that's a film I love, by the way. But it was nice to see people get that.
How does this, having done this role now, what does it sort of say about the kind of projects you're looking for as an actor to take on going forward? How did this sort of help? How does this help inform the other kinds of roles you hope to do?
Yeah, I hope it. You know, if people see it and think, oh, maybe I could do some different things. You know, I love doing comedy, but as I say, it wasn't something that I specifically set out to do exclusively. People, once you start to do comedy, people expect you to do it forever. And also, there's a sort of a weird thing with comedy, and I think it frustrates a lot of comedians, is that you're never taken seriously because what you do is, by its very definition, not serious, and that can kind of become slightly wearing after a while. You know, I think, you know, there are roles that I've had which, particularly like Gary King in The World's End, I think is a very dramatic role. I think he's a very tragic character, but because he's framed within the context of a comedy, you know, people just dismiss him as being ha ha ha. So yeah, I'd like to do more serious roles and spread my wings a little bit.